Hi, listeners. We want to tell you about a podcast we're really digging. It's called Christopher Kimball's Milk Street Radio. Every week, they travel the world to find the most fascinating stories about food, including children who harvest cod tongues after school in Norway and a detective who tracks down food thieves. And on Milk Street Radio, you can always find the unexpected. The comedian who ranks apples using an elaborate 100-point system, the secret history of grocery stores, and how to eat your way through Italy. They also interview the most beloved names in food like Jacques Pepin, Sola El-Waylly, Jose Andres, Jet Tila, Ina Garten, Nigella Lawson, and Padma Lakshmi. Plus, co-hosts Christopher Kimball and Sarah Moulton do live calls with listeners and answer their questions about ingredients, techniques, and culinary mysteries. Like, why roasting a leg of lamb made one caller's oven explode? Ever wonder why your bread won't rise or your souffle falls flat? Chris and Sarah have the answers. You'll also hear from a rotating cast of contributors, including Kenji Lopez-Alt, Cheryl Day, Dan Pashman from The Sporkful, and Alex Ainuz, a French guy cooking from YouTube. Take a listen at 177milkstreet.com/radio or just search your podcast app for Milk Street Radio. You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This is Gastronomica, a Heritage Radio Network podcast. I'm your host for today, Melissa Fuster. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. This week, we offer a peek into Gastronomica's next issue, Summer 2024, coming out soon. And today, Julieta Flores Jurado joins us for a conversation about American food writing and how it has changed since 2020, as part of her forthcoming article, A Time When the Bubble Burst, addressing representation, diversity, and inequality in writings about restaurants in the United States post-2020, which is part of our next edition for Gastronomica 24.2. Julieta is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for North American Studies at the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Julieta, bienvenida. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Yes. So Julieta, can we start? Can you share with our listeners about what is it that you do, where you're based?
Okay, of course. So I am from Mexico City, and I am currently developing a project on the evolving politics and the shifts in the landscape of American food writing and food media more generally. Because my background is in English and Anglophone literature, my initial contact with food studies was through food writing. I have also worked as an instructor and lecturer in our undergraduate program in modern languages and literatures, where I teach literary theory and cultural studies. And so to tell you a little bit about my story with food studies, my undergraduate dissertation dealt with the gastronomical writings of three British women of three different generations. So I was very inspired by early books on feminist food studies, and I learned so much about why women had struggled and still struggle to eat hedonistically, to write about food with a focus on sensual pleasure and curiosity. So that was my first stage or my entrance into food studies. But in recent years, I began realizing that the canon, so to speak, of food writing assumes a certain corporality, both as a writing subject and as a reader or addressee. And I became a lot more interested in exploring, for example, pleasure inequality. Who is welcome or unwelcome in gourmet spaces, whose comfort is not prioritized, and who is not included in gastronomical spaces. And so I feel that in recent years, in the landscape of American food writing, there has been this very productive, at times tense conversation about how the food has not really been very diverse. And if we center a very specific but very influential figure in the field, the restaurant critic, this is one of the jobs that has tended to look like the most normative embodiment of good taste. Usually when we think of restaurant critics, like even if it's like a very stereotypical version of this profession, it looks like a white man who possesses many kinds of capital and privilege. And so in the summer of 2021, I began with my current project, looking at how there was this very urgent demand for diversity in the field of American food writing. And there were many pivotal events starting in 2020. That's why I take this year as the point of departure in my article.
Good, thank you. No, thank you. That is really interesting. And definitely that topic around pleasure in writing. I really like what you mentioned about pleasure inequity, because I feel that really comes out in your piece. So your article, A Time When Bubbles Burst, take us again, as you mentioned, into this examination of food writing post 2020. And the way that you do that is that you take authors, food writers' work, and how they are using their food writing as a platform for activism, right? Now, can you tell us, you already started telling us a little bit more about your motivation, but can you tell us more about what brought you to write specifically about this, and more about restaurants and the specific pieces that you picked?
Okay, sure. So as I was saying, it became very clear, particularly in 2020 and 2021, that it was very necessary for the field to confront a history of implicit bias or the privilege of a very specific kind of corporeality, both in the creation and in the reading side of food writing and food media. And so to answer the question of why to center restaurants, so first I would like to speak a bit about how I defined my source materials for this paper. So I found the best American food writing anthologies, in particular the 2020 and 2021 editions, edited by Kenji Lopez-Alt and by Gabriel Hamilton. And my original aim was to answer questions about how did COVID transform food writing. Such a major global event, of course, must have had a very significant impact on the aims, the themes, the agendas covered by food writing. And I wanted to look at what effects were visible in these sources, how given that they were published in this very tense and difficult period, when the whole world was undergoing a standstill and inequality became so drastic, so impossible to overlook, how did all of these manifest in food writing? And did food writers participate in self-revision, in self-scrutiny? Did they become more active as politically active, or did their work took on a more activist edge? And so in these anthologies, not only did I find an editorial openness to engage with these difficult questions, but I also noticed that restaurants were the protagonists of these stories, and for good reason, because I think we can recall this time when there were so many discussions about how the pandemic exposed the flaws of the restaurant industry. How another consequence that I have also been reflecting on is the end of the era of the genius chef, or the authoritarian chef that was so intrinsical to a particular model of restaurant. And so the pandemic exposed the many flaws of the restaurant industry. And many writers and participants in the field treated this as an opportunity to do better, like a second chance. So if restaurants are going to survive this period, this is a chance to do better and to treat everyone, both staff and diners, more fairly. So this is one of the larger premises of my research, that the COVID-19 emergency was this opportunity to uncover patterns of injustice that had been normalized and tolerated for so long. And going back to restaurants, J. Kenji Lopez-Alt's introduction is very good and very relatable, because it was written at the time when the pandemic was at the most devastating point, at the scariest point. And so he speaks about how food writing seemed so superfluous and so even vain at the time, but we know it was not. So adjustments would have to be made. This does not mean that food writing would remain untouched, but I was so excited to see how many writers responded or rose to the challenge of making food writing more politically active, because if there was a time for greater political incidents, this was it. And restaurants are so significant for neighborhoods, for cities, for understanding like the everyday life of a community. And so if we begin understanding restaurants as very politically significant spaces, very quickly we can see that there are certain codes, there are certain ideas that whether we are aware of them or not. So restaurants are very ideologically loaded spaces, and that is also part of what I learned exploring the writers that I discuss in this article.
Thank you. Yes, no, and we'll get to that, but I want to get more into that tension and everything that your piece uncovers. But before we do, I wanted to go back to the selection of the pieces, and maybe for listeners that are not familiar with the Best American Food Writing series, can we go back and just tell us a little bit more about the series? Like there is an editorial process, right, of editors picking specific articles to include. If you can just tell us about how that series is made in the first place, and then maybe your own process of selecting pieces within the series.
Of course. So this is a series edited by HarperCollins Publishers, and there are other similar anthologies as part of the larger series, like for example the Best American Essays or the Best American Short Stories. Some of those even deal with specific subgenres, like for example the Best American Sci-Fi Stories or Mystery Stories. And so this is a relatively new addition to this series, and I believe it started back in 2017 or 2018. But what is peculiar about the series is that there is a guest editor every year who is a prominent figure in the food industry, whether they are journalists or chefs. And so I think it offers this interesting angle on how the field looks through the eyes of a fellow food writer. So it is not an editor who applies a personal criteria, but instead we have this look at the state of the field every year from the perspective of a fellow food writer. And so I was, it was a good finding that I could encounter like these correspondences with my intuition about how the field had been changed in 2020. So many of these changes had begun earlier, but Kenji Lopez-Alt's introduction confirmed like many of these intuitions about how food writers themselves were very self-aware of the need for this self-revision or for this reconsideration of what would be the civic role of food writing in the future. And one thing I forgot to say is that there is an open call. So readers of the anthology, or in general readers who enjoy food writing, they can submit their nominees for the following year's edition. And so that's also interesting that it represents the shifting tastes or the shifting interests of the reading public. And all of this is mediated by the guest editor and by the general editor of the series. But what is valuable over all of these anthologies is that they present this state of the field every year.
Good. Thank you. Yeah. And again, that was really interesting to learn about that sort of crowdsourcing, right, among the readers and how they selected.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. And were there, I know, and in your article, you have, again, these specific works within the series, right? So what were there others that you left out? What was your own selection process for the piece?
That's always a question that I struggle a bit with because the essays were so fascinating in many senses. So, of course, I had to leave many valuable pieces out, as I'm sure the guest editors had to do in their turn. There is a list at the end of each anthology with these honorable mentions, so that you can, if you're hungry for more stories that represent the best or the most original stories of the year, you can also check those out. And I decided to center on restaurants again because it was one of the subjects that received the most attention in these years, like what's going to happen with restaurants if they have to move entirely to a takeout model, or what's going to happen to restaurant criticism if you cannot visit a restaurant, at least for the time being, or the experience is so difficult from what it was before. Now it's relatively back to normal, but it was such a different experience, to figure out how were we going to be safe in public spaces, how to make sure that the staff were also safe. So all of these made restaurants a very critical issue in the editions of these 2 years. And I was also, I tried to at least provide a glance of this in my article, how many of the stories also deal with what was it to cook under lockdown. For example, home cooking was a major theme in these years. Also nostalgia for the small businesses that would not make it, or nostalgia for inviting friends over and eating together, and all those things that for a short but very scary time felt so out of reach, and we felt that we were never going to go back to how it was before. And in the end, this is also part of the open question that remains at the end of the article, how can we go back to the things that were enjoyable and that were, how can we go back to those moments and to those experiences surrounding food that were pleasant and enjoyable, but also how do we keep a sharper focus on important issues like climate change or inequality or all sorts of injustice that are involved when one consumes real food, but also food media inside a bubble. And that's why I, with the help of my advisor here at CISAN, we came with this metaphor of the bubble and how we should be very careful not to build these bubbles again after the pandemic seems more distant in time.
And I will say also that as somebody that also works with the restaurant sector in my own research, I really appreciated your piece in that it brought in that reminder that not everything is rosy or pleasurable in this space. And I really appreciated that tension between the enjoyment and escapism of the restaurant experience, but then also reminding us of everything that the exclusionary oppressive hierarchies in which these experiences are built. So it's something, again, I wanted to talk more about this with you. And first, is this an accurate take on the article? Any ways as you were, I was imagining you as you were writing this, how can we contend reconcile these tensions when we not only engage with food writing, but also as restaurant patrons, consumers?
Okay, so yes, I think of how the experience of the pandemic and also understanding better like the predicament not only of restaurant workers but also of food writers. So it has uncovered many truths that are difficult to unsee. Something that I would also like to mention is that two media events have also been very influential in my current research. So when I was thinking through this project, the Bon Appetit Reckoning in the year before, that was a very pivotal event when it became very clear that food writing as a creative field could do much better in its civic function, and how issues of gender and race and class could not be sidelined anymore, but instead they had to be addressed, and this would be integral for food media and journalism to become more democratic. And so this in the space of representations and food writing and food media, but concerning actual restaurants, I also wanted to mention the work of Soleil Ho, which is very prominently featured in the article. They are a former food critic at the San Francisco Chronicle, and they challenged the lack of an intersectional perspective in food media many years ago. And what is so important about their work is how they help readers, or I believe that when you read the work of Soleil Ho, you become a lot more mindful of whether restaurants can accommodate bodies of different sizes or people who do not conform to the gender binary. You become a lot more aware of the positionality that you are invited to adopt when you dine at a certain restaurant. So I found their work so eye-opening, so essential to understand how restaurants are loaded with ideology, and as I was saying, they represent public life and neighborhoods and living in a city, but they are not welcoming to everyone, and not only because of cost. So in the end, part of the research that did not find a place in the article had to do with the story of restaurant criticism, the history of restaurant criticism, the history of lifestyle publications, and how restaurants represent this kind of democratic impulse when they start to pop out in cities in Europe and then around the world. How restaurants are this kind of public squares, or like a kind of substitute, or the closest thing that we have now for public squares, where you can interact with neighbors, where you can dine in public, and that is part of the kind of everyday performance we do as citizens. But even if restaurants are technically very democratic, because as long as you can afford the bill or afford the food that they serve, it's technically open to everyone. There is so much more that could be done in terms of making these places more accessible for people with disabilities, accessible for people with larger bodies. And there are many codes that implicitly tell you about the kind of bodies that are privileged in certain spaces. And so I have become a lot more mindful, and I think that we can still speak a lot more about how restaurants are still or how restaurants could do better in this respect, in how to make sure that the cost is not the only filter or the only barrier, and how they can be welcoming truly for all kinds of bodies.
Thank you. No, and that's something I also wanted to highlight, because again, you do address key structural factors that I feel are more in other conversations, such as race, gender, and class. But I also wanted to highlight, especially what you started talking about diversity of bodies, and also diversity of abilities, which I think is even I feel a blind spot in scholarship sometimes. Can you speak more about this, about how food writing or how restaurants can potentially be better about addressing the diversity of abilities?
Okay, sure. I'm not really, or I'm very new in the field of disability studies, although I intend to learn a lot more about this field in the near future. But another area that I have been doing a lot more readings is in the field of fat studies and fat liberation and body justice. And so I find that gourmet spaces, or food writing in particular, still has a lot of way to go in terms of being respectful and inclusive of larger bodies. So, for example, there is a recent book by Professor Kate Mann, who teaches philosophy at Cornell. Her book is called On Shrinking. And she writes about how in the classical world, gluttony and larger bodies were not associated culturally. They were not connected, and they were treated as separate issues. But now that, after many years of healthism, of like assigning this higher aesthetic and even a higher moral value to thin bodies, it was very impressive or very shocking to me to see how food writing and food criticism, restaurant criticism in particular, assumed thin bodies as the norm, because there is all this construction of a subject who is in control, who is very rational, who can evaluate food from a perspective of good taste and intellectual authority. And it's very terrible to see that all these attributes that speak of authority, of rationality, implicitly they are associated with thin bodies. So that's something that I want to write more about anti-fat bias in food writing, and how this is one of the areas of social justice that needs more urgent attention. I think that we have made great progress in terms of addressing gender, addressing race, addressing class even, and the biases that food writing has been complicit with. But in terms of body liberation and justice for people of all sizes, first, it's very urgent that food writing refuses to be complicit with diet culture and refuses to be complicit with anti-fat bias.
No, thank you. No, and that's definitely it is. I can see that as an emerging topic as well. And I hear you. I am also starting to get to understand a little bit better that aspect of abilities, physical abilities. That's also, again, I feel very, very much missing in the restaurant experience, and also in this work, in our work in food studies sometimes. Now, I wanted to ask you back to your title, A Time When the Bubble Burst, right? That I think that when you think of a bubble, it implies that is a cozy place, a comfortable space, and the bursting is like this sudden change, right? So, and I wanted to talk more about the public reaction, the reader's reaction to this. Because again, your article, another piece that it includes is you engage Goodreads reviews. That is a site for popular book reviews, and you do include very thoughtful reviewers. I felt in the piece, but I wanted to ask you about reviews that you didn't include, or if there were people pushing back against the bursting of the bubble.
I think the general atmosphere has shifted very much from the time that, as I mentioned in the article, even someone as influential, as beloved as Anthony Bourdain felt that he was discouraged from mixing politics and food writing. How even Bourdain was pressured to preserve like a kind of artificial purity when discussing food. So he was very political, particularly at the end of his career, but still he remarked in some interviews about how he had been discouraged of being like too controversial, or like bringing too much discomfort and confrontation to the table. And when I was browsing through the reviews of Goodreads, the main issue is that people disagree with the selection. And of course, we would have gotten very different anthologies through the perspective of different editors. So I think that all of this contributes to a point that I was also trying to make, that food writing is gradually moving away from a prescriptive function and instead does not aim to be entirely representative or homogenizing. And I believe that the editorial perspective of the series does a good job of establishing that many great pieces in the end maybe deserve more attention. Still, I believe it's valuable as a state of the field, and there are great works and very incisive, very critical works that maybe did not find their audience at the right time. So I think it also has to do with the shifting priorities or shifting interests of audiences, that anthologies that include a greater variety of texts that are explicitly political from different angles are receiving more attention. So we see this kind of balance, this kind of encounter between the topics that a particular editor wishes to highlight, the interests of a general audience, and then Goodreads again is a good place to learn about how no selection is perfect or no selection will be truly representative. So maybe the adjective "the best" still speaks of a certain judgment or a certain hierarchy of what food writing is worth like preserving in a more permanent format, because many of these works are published only online, and so they are given a more permanent form in a printed book, in an anthology, this kind of recognition of their achievement. But still, the good or the positive part of looking into Goodreads is that we can see that the priorities of the publishing house might not always be perfectly in touch with the priorities or the interests of audiences, and that's perhaps extensive to the broader transformations of literature and consumption of books now mediated through social media.
Thank you, Julieta. That is interesting. And again, it was really interesting to see you interacting with the reviews, just to have a sense about how people were receiving this different way of writing about food. Now, I wanted to also, I know this might not be a fair question, taking you a little bit away from the article and what you have been studying. But just if you can indulge this question, it's just that I was curious because while your work focuses on food writing from the United States, because you are situated physically in Mexico, I was wondering, do you see similarities in these issues? Or I assume that you can also interact with food writing coming from the Mexican authors. Yeah, just this curiosity question. How do you see these two contexts compare with each other? Or do you see similarities, different types of exclusions in Mexico versus the United States?
The context is very different, of course. I think that, food media is a lot smaller as a cultural field in Mexico. So if you want to look like for more subversive interpretations of the role of food media, I think it's worth looking into independent creators and people who are starting with podcasts, with social media accounts. And legacy media, I believe, remains very focused on recipes, on healthy eating, but this kind of more subversive or this critical, progressive, social justice-minded angle, I think remains relatively small in more traditional print or legacy media, at least in the Spanish-speaking context that I'm familiar with. But I could recommend, for example, the work of Mapa de Barmaids. They have social media accounts at Instagram focused on exploring the food industry in Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. And they offer this reading of the food landscape through a feminist perspective, and in particular, they are very concerned with issues of labor in restaurants and how gender-based violence can be prevented in professional kitchens. And they have been very critical of this model of the genius chef that has served to legitimize or to justify many instances of unfair treatment of workers, unpaid labor, and even physical or verbal or emotional abuse. So I think that to find these more subversive, these more progressive takes on food media, it's worth looking into the work of independent creators from Mexico, from different parts of Latin America, because overall, I would say that legacy media remains very focused on recipes, on this didactic part of food writing, and on healthy eating, but without a more critical consideration of what do we mean by health and why is it so morally valuable if healthism, for example, has been criticized as an ideology for so long. But again, overall, as I said, food writing can engage with this topic in a more intensified way.
Thank you. Thank you for providing us that comparative perspective, because unfortunately, issues around class, gender, all of these things, unfortunately, are not just in the States, but it's really interesting to see how these important issues are being treated differently in different contexts, social, media context. Now, as the pandemic period is, even though COVID is still around, right? I feel that urgency and that climate of 2020, everything that happened in that year is starting to feel more as a memory, right? I wanted to ask you now, as you, based on when you finished the piece to now, do you see a slow reversal in food writing to something that you mentioned in the end of your piece, of the potential for food writing to revert back to exclusionary, elitist blind spots in the way that food is and restaurants are addressed in the writing? Do you see that, or do you see these efforts, activist efforts, to bring up the structural issues out? Are they still present? What do you see nowadays?
Something that I noticed later, so in the past year, also has to do with how representations of professional kitchens all of a sudden were everywhere. So particularly due to the influence and popularity of The Bear, the TV series, which the third season is premiering in a few days, and it's generating all this excitement. And so I think we see that those kind of conversations about how restaurant workers have struggled under very unfair conditions, how restaurants are still struggling to get back on their feet after the pandemic. So the success of that TV show, for example, I think is representative of how we are still in the middle of this kind of conversations. They have not quite quieted down after the pandemic. And so this coexists still with some signs of a slower progress, if not a complete stoppage or a reversal. For example, going back also to the context of Mexico, the Michelin Guide arrived in my country only a few weeks ago. And so it was very disorienting for me personally. We have done all this work of challenging the normative, Eurocentric, male-centered instances of legitimacy and value. And all of a sudden, the Michelin Guide is celebrated as something that should have been here earlier. When, it creates a hierarchy of foodways, of restaurants, of ways of eating in public that I don't know if it was quite necessary. So this is something that has been interesting in the last few weeks, like this debate about whether the Michelin Guide seems out of touch with the current state of Mexican cuisine and the social reality that makes possible this cuisine. And in the end, if I look or if I focus on the example of what we could call like toxic chefs and how they have been addressed in food writing from before with the Me Too movement, for example, and how there was this awareness of patterns of abuse that were tolerated in the industry and that food media had been complicit with by celebrating very violent, problematic figures, and by making possible like this ascent to great power of certain chefs. And but still, I read an article the other day about why, for example, the shows of Gordon Ramsay are still produced and are enjoyed by millions of viewers, even if we thought that we had moved beyond the archetype of the angry, explosive, volatile chef. So it's perhaps a moment of transition where we can see the coexistence of older models that have been very criticized and have been challenged, but they are not completely gone. So in the end, yes, I would not say that this is a process that will be visible from one day to the other. So the metaphor of the bubble perhaps suggests like a very sudden implosion, and I understand that. But I would also like to emphasize that the bubble had been like punctured before, and so not all bubbles have exploded. But this has been a longer process of like beginning also to use another metaphor, to make cracks in oppressive structures, and so walls do not fall down as quickly as we would like sometimes, but there are definitely signs of this kind of punctures or this kind of fissures in oppressive structures.
Thank you. And I do agree that we might be talking about cracks or even bubbles within bubbles, right? Because if general consumers out there may not even be reading about this activist writing or even thinking about this as they go to restaurants. So maybe to conclude, maybe can you offer some reflections, or what would you like to see next on the side of consumers, of not only of restaurants, of course, patrons that are aware of these tensions? How can we be better restaurant patrons to create the change that is needed, and maybe also as consumers of these food writing, what would you like to see so that we can keep pushing at those cracks or keep bursting across multiple bubbles, whatever whatever imagery you want to use?
So my work has always been focused on the consumption side of food systems, but of course there is so much potential in looking also at production and distribution and the processing of food that has been mainly reserved to documentaries, for example, and to see this kind of content in more in a wider variety of forms. I think that could be very valuable. So to look into the problems with food systems, not only in documentaries, but also a lot more featured in social media, in periodicals, in podcasts, for example. And there are so many resources that we can go to learn more about that. So it's difficult also for me to resist like the impulse to foreground individual choices, because that's also something that I feel makes different the current wave of more politicized American food writing, that it has moved beyond the very individual focus of previous generations. So something that we can learn from, for example, the work of Josie Johnston and Cheyenne Bauman, and also Charlotte Bildekoff in their work on foodies and the alternative food movement, is that even if there were valuable insights in this movement, but their political incidence was limited by a very narrow focus on individual choices and lifestyles. So it's difficult for me to think of how can we avoid replicating that idea of us as individual consumers, and instead to think more collectively and to consider, well, the fact that I am comfortable in this restaurant, even if I like the food, I like the atmosphere, I can try to be more alert of how other people whose bodies, whose experiences are different from mine, they might not be so comfortable. And so together we could demand that kind of changes, but it also has to be always accompanied by regulations, by clearer guidelines on how restaurants should have inclusive policies that are complied with.
Thank you. And definitely what you mentioned about that heightened awareness are things that articles like yours then bring into these conversations. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today, Julieta, and for that contribution to our next issue of Gastronomica.
Thank you, Melissa. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you as well to the Gastronomica editorial collective. I am very pleased to have been here and also very honored to have my work featured in Gastronomica. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your contribution. And listeners will find the full piece in the next issue of Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, issue 24.2, coming out soon. For more details, visit gastronomica.org and join us again next week as we talk with Alisa Paredes about food memory and forgotten labor in Celebrated Stories of Banana Ketchup. And also subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes this season. Thank you.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.